I have stood beside a great many men on the forecourt of Harrogate Palace, and I have watched most of them flinch at one time or another, at a firecracker, at a shove, at a woman fainting in the summer crush of the crowd. It is no shame. The body wants to move. That is what a body is for. The whole trick of our trade is to teach it not to. So I want you to understand before I tell you what the thug did that I have seen the very best of us twitch. And I want you to understand that on the afternoon a stranger reached up and closed his fist around the medals on Sergeant Corin Devane's chest and tried to tear them from him. Corin did not move a single muscle that he had not decided in advance to move. That is where it begins, not with the thug. With this stillness, the thug mistook for weakness. My name is Alwyn Reese, and at the time I held the corporal's post 12 feet to Corin's left, at the far pillar of the north gate, close enough to hear a whisper and forbidden to answer one. It was the last dry hour of a gray afternoon, the kind that cannot decide whether to rain, and the crowd behind the low iron rail was the ordinary weekday crowd, tourists with their phones held high, a coach party in matching orange caps, a father lifting a small one onto his shoulders to see over the heads. Corin stood his box in the full ceremonial scarlet, the bearskin throwing a hard shadow over the top half of his face, white gloves at the seams of his trousers, the rifle at his shoulder, and on his breast the row of medals that every one of those phones had, at one point or another, zoomed toward and photographed without ever once asking what they were. They never ask. That is the thing about the medals. To the crowd they are bright buttons, a splash of color and brass against the red, a detail in a photograph they will show their friends. Nobody on the far side of that rail knew that the third ribbon from the left had been pinned to Corin's chest by the king's own hand, or what Corin had walked into to earn it, or who he had walked in to reach. They saw shininess. They did not see cost. I have come to think that most of the cruelty in the world is exactly that, a man who sees a thing shine and never once wonders what it cost. The thug arrived at the rail a little after 3. I marked him before he did anything, because marking people is half of what the post is for. He was broad through the shoulders and moved the way men move when they have learned that space belongs to whoever is willing to take it. He wore a dark hooded jacket zipped to the throat despite the mild air, and he came through the crowd not the way a tourist comes, drifting, gawping, but with a straight line and a set jaw, parting the orange caps with his elbows as though they were curtains. 2 others trailed in his wake, younger, laughing at nothing, filming already. I did not yet know their names. I would learn one of them later in a courtroom, and I have not forgotten it since. But at the rail he was only a shape with intent, and my whole body did what training makes it do. It went very calm and very awake at the same time. He stopped directly in front of Corin's box. He looked the sergeant up and down, slow, insolent, the way you look at a thing you have already decided to touch. "Look at this one," he said loud for his friends and their cameras, standing there like he owns the place, like he's better than everybody. He tipped his chin at the medals. "What are those, then? Play badges. You buy them in the gift shop." Corin did not move. That is not a figure of speech. His eyes stayed level on the middle distance, on the point above the crowd that we are trained to hold, and the rifle stayed at his shoulder, and his chest rose and fell with the small, slow breathing of a man who intends to be exactly where he is for a long time. To the thug, that stillness read as contempt. I have watched this misreading 100 times, and it never fails to fascinate me. The arrogant man cannot imagine that a person would decline to answer him out of discipline, so he decides it must be out of scorn, and the scorn he invents in the other man is really only his own, reflected. The thug's face darkened. "Oh, you think you're too good to talk to me." He leaned across the rail close enough now that I could see the sweat at his temple and smell the sour edge of whatever he'd been drinking. "Say something. Go on, I'm talking to you." A beat. Then, uglier. "You're not a soldier, you're a doll in a costume for the tourists." The crowd had begun to sense it. That is how these things go on the forecourt. First, one person lowers their phone from the palace and turns it sideways to catch the man at the rail. Then 3 do. Then the whole loose crowd tightens into a horseshoe with the 2 of them at the mouth of it, and the air changes. A woman near the front took a half step back and pulled her coat closed as though the temperature had dropped. The father with the small one on his shoulders swung the little figure down and moved off to the side. People know, before anything happens, when something is going to happen. "Devane," I said very low, not moving my lips more than I had to. It was against every rule for me to speak, and I did it anyway, and I would do it again. It was not a warning he needed. He had marked the man before I had. It was only that I could not stand there and say nothing, and so I said his name, the way you touch a man's shoulder in the dark to tell him you are there. He gave no sign he heard, but I knew he had. The thug's friends were egging him now. "Go on then," one of them called. "Make him break." 10 quid says you can't make him break. And the crowd's phones were a wall of small glass eyes, and the thug, being exactly the kind of man he was, could not now walk away, because to walk away from a silent man who has not so much as blinked at you, in front of a laughing audience and a wall of cameras, is to lose. He had trapped himself. He did not know it yet. Men like that never do until the trap has already closed. "All right," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than the loudness. "All right, you won't talk. Let's see if you feel this." And he reached across the rail, and he took hold of the medals on Corin Devane's chest, and he pulled. I want to tell this part slowly, because it happened fast and because the speed of it is exactly the thing the cameras missed. To the crowd it looked like a lunge and a scuffle, and then, somehow, the thug on the ground. To me, 12 feet away and trained to read the smallest economy of movement, it was one of the most deliberate things I have ever watched a man do. Understand what the pull was. It was not a slap, which is an insult that lands on the skin and is gone. It was a grip and a wrench, 4 fingers and a thumb closing on a row of ribbon and brass that had been pinned there by a king, and hauling with a grown man's weight behind it to rip them away. The medals are not stuck on with a sticker. They are fixed through the wool of the tunic with clasps and a mounting bar, and a hard enough pull will not lift them cleanly. It will tear the cloth, and it will drive the pin backs into the chest beneath. Corin felt all of that. I know he did because I saw the single muscle in his jaw stand out and then release. But his feet did not move. His rifle arm did not move. His head did not turn. He let the man pull. For perhaps a second and a half, which is a very long time when you count it out, Sergeant Corin Devane simply stood and permitted a thug to try to tear the honor off his chest, and did nothing. That, more than anything that came after, is what I want you to remember. Because the crowd and later the whole watching country would fasten onto what happened next, the turn, the fall, the arrest, the reveal. But the true thing, the thing that told me exactly who Corin was, happened in that second and a half of chosen stillness. He was not frozen. He was not afraid. He was doing arithmetic. He was a man standing his post with a loaded rifle and a set of orders, in front of a crowd that included frightened people, and he was working out, in the space of a breath, how to answer this without turning a public forecourt into something none of us could take back. The easy thing, the animal thing, was to break the man's arm across the rail. He had the training. He had the reach. He could have done it before the thug finished his pull. He did not do the easy thing. He did the hard thing, which was to wait a heartbeat longer and do exactly enough, and not 1 grain more. The pull failed. That is the first thing to say plainly, because the thug had assumed, as bullies assume, that a wrench would win by force alone. But the medals are mounted for parade and inspection and long hours of standing. They are made to hold. The mounting bar bent. The wool gave a little, 1 clasp sprang. But the row held, and the thug's hand, expecting the resistance to vanish, instead met a chest as solid as the pillar behind it, and his own momentum carried him forward off his balance, half over the low rail. His weight suddenly hung on a grip that would not come free. And now Corin moved. He moved the way water moves when a dam opens, not violently, but with everything at once and nowhere wasted. His left hand came off the seam of his trousers and closed over the thug's wrist, not to strike it but to trap it against his own chest, pinning the grasping hand exactly where it was, so that the man who had reached in to take something was now held fast to the very thing he'd grabbed, unable to let go, unable to pull back, hung on his own greed like a fish on a hook. Corin's right arm brought the rifle down and across in a short controlled arc, not a blow, never a blow, but a bar of wood and steel laid along the thug's forearm, levering it, so that the man's own trapped weight and the fulcrum of the rail did the rest. The thug went down, not thrown, folded. His knees hit the cobbles on the crowd's side of the rail, and his cheek came to rest against the cold iron, his arm still pinned upward and across into Corin's grip, and the whole of him held there, bent and helpless, by a sergeant who had not so much as changed the expression on his face. It had taken, from the pull to the fold, less time than it takes to read this sentence. The crowd made a single sound, a sharp collective intake, half gasp and half cheer, the sound a crowd makes when the thing they feared turns out to be the thing they hoped for. And then, into the ringing quiet after it, Corin Devane spoke for the first time. He did not shout. He bent his head a fraction toward the man folded at his boots, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry no further than the two of them, and yet somehow heard by everyone, "These do not come off, sir, not for you, not ever." Then he straightened, and he was a statue again, holding a struggling man in place with one gloved hand as easily as he held the rifle in the other, his eyes back on the middle distance, waiting for what the crowd did not yet understand. I understood. 12 feet away, I had already turned my head a precise 30 degrees toward the guardroom arch, where the duty patrol would even now be moving, because the thing about the forecourt that the thug never grasped is that it is not one man alone. It never was. The stillness he mocked was the visible tip of a whole disciplined body, and he had just put his hand into the middle of it. But I am getting ahead of myself. To tell you why those medals could not come off, why Corin would sooner have let the man break his chest than let the ribbons go, I have to take you back, past that gray afternoon, to a different day and a different Corin, and to the thing he walked into to earn the third ribbon from the left. Bear with me. The story of the pull is quick. The story of what the pull was reaching for is the one that matters. I first stood a post beside Corin Devane 4 years before any of this. I was new then, 20 and raw, still fighting my own body's wish to shift its weight, and he was already the man the younger guardsman watched to learn how it was done. He was not the biggest of us, nor the loudest. In fact, I do not think I heard Corin raise his voice, off the drill square, in all the years I knew him. But there was a quality to his stillness that made you understand stillness was not the absence of something. It was the presence of a great deal held. He came from the river country in the north, from one of those flat green parishes where the water is always half a decision away from coming over the banks, and where every family keeps a boat not for pleasure, but for the years the river remembers it can rise. His father had been a lockkeeper. His younger brother, Tam, was the light of the whole family. I had this from Corin himself, on one of the rare late nights when talk loosens, years into our friendship, a laughing, reckless boy 6 years his junior who Corin had half-raised while their father worked the locks and their mother kept the parish school. "I taught him to swim," Corin told me once, turning a cup in his hands. "In the mill pond summers, I taught him too well. He was never afraid of water after that." That was the trouble with Tam. He was never afraid of anything, and I was afraid enough for both of us. I did not know, that night, how much those 2 sentences would come to weigh. The medals on Corin's chest were 4, but only 3 of them were, to him, real. The first was long service, time, nothing more, a ribbon for outlasting. The second was for a tour with a peacekeeping detachment on a border neither of us had chosen, dull and cold and mostly waiting. He wore both without much feeling. It was the third that he would have died on that rail to keep, and the fourth beside it, and to tell you why I have to tell you about the night the river took the low parishes, the year Corin was still a young guardsman home on his leave. He told it to me only once, whole and even then in pieces, and I have set them in order since. It had rained for 11 days. The river that his father had spent his life persuading through the locks had by the 9th day stopped listening to anyone, and on the 11th night it came over the top of the eastern bank in the dark, all at once, the way a wall does not lean and then finally fall, one moment a bank, the next a torrent through the streets of the parish where he had grown up. Corin was home. His leave had 2 days left. He had been asleep in his boyhood room when the water came under the door. What he did next is written down in the citation, in the flat, careful language such things are written in, and I have read the citation, and it is a lie of omission the way all citations are, because it lists what he did and leaves out entirely what it was like. It says that guardsman Corin Devane, finding the family of the lockkeeper's house cut off by rising floodwater, did on 11 separate occasions enter the water to bring persons to safety. 11. It says he brought out his mother first, and then a neighbor, an old man who could not swim, clinging to a chimney across the flooded lane. It says he went back for the 2 small daughters of the schoolmistress next door, who had been in his mother's care that night, and brought them out one under each arm through a current that had already carried 2 motor cars down the lane like corks. It says that, in the course of these acts, he sustained injuries. It says, at the very end in the same flat voice, that he did all of this in the knowledge that his younger brother, Tam Devane, aged 19, had gone into the water ahead of him to raise the alarm and had not come back. That is the sentence the citation is really about, and it is the one it hurries past. Tam had woken first. Tam, who was never afraid of water, who Corin had taught too well, had gone out into the black flood to bang on doors and wake the parish, and somewhere in that first hour the current had taken him, and Corin, who came awake to his mother screaming and a flood in the hall, spent the whole of that night doing the 2 things at once that no man should have to do at all, saving every soul he could reach, and looking between each rescue in the wrong direction downstream for the one soul he could not. They found Tam 3 days later, 4 miles down, past the second lock. In the branches of a willow the flood had half drowned. He had got 11 families out of their beds before the water took him. 11. The same number Corin carried out with his own arms. I have never been able to decide whether that matching of the count is a cruelty or a mercy, and I have never asked Corin, because I think he has decided it is neither, that it is only the arithmetic of a bad night, and that to make it mean anything more would be to make Tam smaller than he was. The king came north himself 3 weeks after, when the water had gone down and the parish was digging mud out of its houses. There was no grand ceremony. The king was not there for a ceremony. But before he left he had Corin brought to him, and he took the 3rd ribbon and its medal from the hand of an aide, and he pinned it on the young guardsman's chest himself. And what he said, Corin told me this last and only this, and never repeated it, was not about valor. The king said, I cannot give you back your brother. I would if the giving were mine. This is not a substitute for him. It is only the country's word that it saw what you did and will not forget it. And the 4th medal, the one beside the 3rd, came later, and was in its way the heavier of the 2, for it was struck for the 11 he saved, and every time Corin looked down at it, he was looking at 11 people who were alive because of a night that had cost him the one he loved most. So that is what the thug reached up to tear off. Not badges, not shininess, a dead brother's name and 11 living ones and a king's promise not to forget. When Corin said, These do not come off, sir, not for you, not ever, he was not being proud. He was telling the plain truth. Those medals were the only place left where he could stand beside Tam. A man does not let you tear that away with a laugh for the cameras. He would let you break his ribs first, and Corin very nearly did. Now back to the forecourt, and the man folded at his boots. The duty patrol came through the guardroom arch at a controlled double, 4 of them, boots crisp on the stone, and the crowd parted for them the way crowds do, half in relief and half in a new kind of hunger, because now the phones had a second act to film. The thug was still bent over the rail with his wrist pinned to Corin's chest, and he had begun, too late, to understand his position. He was swearing now, low and furious, and trying to wrench his arm free, and finding that the more he pulled the more the sergeant's single-gloved hand simply held, without strain, without any sign of effort at all, as though holding a grown, thrashing man against a rail were the most natural extension of standing still. "Let go of me," the thug spat. "Let go, you can't touch me. You can't touch me, I know my rights, you can't lay a hand on me." Which was, I have always thought, the most revealing thing he said, more revealing even than the taunts. He had put his own hand on Corin. He had reached across a barrier and gripped and hauled at another man's body to tear something from it. And now held, his very first instinct was to claim the untouchability he had just denied to someone else. That is the whole shape of the arrogant in one sentence. What is mine to do to you is not yours to do to me. Corin, of course, said nothing to it. He did not need to. The answer was already arriving in boots through the arch. The patrol sergeant that afternoon was a broad, unhurried man named Bracken, 20 years in, who had seen everything twice and had long ago stopped being surprised by any of it. He took in the whole of the scene in about the time it takes to blink: the folded man, the pinned wrist, the torn wool at Corin's breast where the tunic had given, the bent mounting bar, the row of medals hanging slightly crooked but hanging. And he did not rush, and he did not shout, and that unhurriedness was itself a kind of verdict. He came to a halt at the thug's shoulder and looked down at him with the mild, terrible patience of a man who has all the authority in the world and no need to raise his voice about it. "You've laid hands on a soldier of the household guard at his post," Bracken said, "in front of about 200 witnesses and 40 cameras, and you've tried to steal decorations awarded by the Crown. I want you to understand, before another word, that whatever you thought was going to happen here is not what is going to happen here." "He grabbed me," the thug said. "You saw it, he grabbed me, I want him done for assault." "Sergeant Devane," Bracken said, not to the thug, "you can release him to us." And Corin opened his gloved hand. He did it without a flicker, the way he did everything, and the thug, who had been pulling backward with all his strength against a grip that would not yield, suddenly found the grip gone and pitched over backward onto the cobbles on the crowd's side of the rail, sprawling, his hood fallen back, his face for the first time fully in the light and fully in view of every camera on the forecourt. And there was a sound from the crowd then that I had not expected, a low ripple of recognition, of murmuring, phone screens turning toward one another, someone saying a name aloud that I did not catch. I would understand that ripple later too. The thug's face was, it turned out, a face some of the crowd already knew. But at the time I only saw a big man on his backside on the stones, his dignity gone in front of the very audience he had gathered to watch him win, scrambling up with his jacket twisted, and his friends, the two who had been filming, who had been egging him on, who had bet 10 quid he could make the doll break, already melting backward into the crowd, their cameras suddenly pointed at the ground, wanting no part of the thing they had wanted every part of a moment before. That is the other law of the forecourt, and it never fails. The friends of the arrogant man are his friends only up to the exact moment the arrogance costs something. Then they are strangers who happen to be standing near him. The patrol took him. It was done without violence, which is the point I keep returning to, because the whole of the crowd had gathered in the hope of violence, and what they got instead was procedure. 2 guardsmen taking an arm each, Bracken speaking the formal words. The man walked away through the parting crowd toward the side gate and the waiting of the civil authorities, still protesting, still declaring his rights, his voice getting higher and thinner the further he went until the murmur of the crowd swallowed it. And Corin Devane, his tunic torn, his medals crooked, the pin backs of them by now surely biting into the skin of his chest, straightened his shoulders and squared his feet, and returned the rifle to the perfect angle it had held before any of it, and became once more a statue at his post, eyes forward, as though nothing at all had occurred. The crowd did not disperse. That was the first sign that this was going to be more than an afternoon's incident. They should have drifted off. The show was over, the man taken away. Instead they stayed, and the phone stayed up but pointed now at Corin, at the torn wool and the crooked ribbons and the man who wore both without acknowledgement. And I watched something move through that crowd that I have only rarely seen move through a crowd and never learned to name properly. Call it shame, turning slowly into respect. They had come to watch a man be humbled. They had assumed, gathering, that it would be the guard. And now they stood in front of the wrong man humbled and the right man standing, and they did not quite know what to do with themselves, and so they simply stayed and were quiet and looked. Corin stood the rest of his watch. That too I need you to know, because it is easy to imagine that after such a thing a man would be taken off his post, sat down, tended to. He was not, and he would not have allowed it if it had been offered, because to leave the box early would have been to let the thug win the one thing left to win, the removal of the guard from his ground. So Corin stood, torn and bleeding under his tunic where the pinbacks had gone into him, for another 40 minutes, until the changing of the guard came at its appointed time and not 1 minute before it. And only then, when the relief marched up and the ancient words were exchanged, and his box was properly filled by another man, did he turn and march off under the arch with the rest of us, ramrod straight, his crooked metals catching the gray light. He did not touch them, not once, the whole way in. I watched him. He wanted to. His right hand twitched toward his chest twice, and he did not let it. There would be time for the metals inside, out of sight. On the forecourt in front of them he would not so much as check whether they were still there. He knew they were. He had felt them hold. It was only in the guard room, with the door shut, that he let himself sit, and let the sergeant open his tunic, and I saw what the pull had done. It was not much, as injuries go, and Corin was almost embarrassed by the fuss. 2 puncture marks and a long shallow tear where the mounting bar had been driven and dragged across the skin of his chest, the whole area angry and beginning to bruise in the shape of the metals themselves. A strange dark blazon printed on him by the very things a man had tried to steal. The surgeon cleaned it and dressed it and told Corin dryly that he would have a scar shaped roughly like his own decorations, which was either a curse or a blessing depending how you looked at it. Corin looked at it in the small mirror on the guardroom wall, the metal-shaped bruise blooming over his heart, and he said nothing, but I saw the corner of his mouth move, and I have always thought that he did not mind it, that there was even something in him that was glad of it. He had spent 4 years wearing his brother's memory on the outside of his coat where anyone could photograph it and no one understood it. Now it was on the inside too, printed into the skin, where no thug could ever reach it, and where it would stay long after the wool was mended. There was one more thing that happened on the forecourt that afternoon, in the quiet after the patrol took the thug away, and I have kept it for here because it belongs beside the injury and not before it. A woman came to the rail, not the one who had stepped back, another, older, with a plain coat and gray hair pinned under a scarf, the sort of woman you would pass 100 times in a market and never mark. She had been near the front of the crowd the whole while, and she had not filmed, I noticed. Her phone had stayed in her pocket. She came to the rail directly in front of Corin's box, in the space the thug had vacated, and she stood there for a moment looking up at him, and then she did a thing that nobody on that forecourt had thought to do all afternoon, in all the taunting and the pulling and the filming. She asked. "Young man," she said, quiet, not expecting an answer, for she surely knew he could not give one on his post, "what are they for? Your medals? What did you do?" And then, because he of course said nothing and only stood with his eyes forward, she nodded to herself as if his silence were itself an answer, and she said, "My husband had one, just the one. He never told me what it was for either. 20 years I asked, and he'd only say, 'It's for the men who aren't here to wear theirs.'" She looked up at the crooked ribbons over the torn wool, and her eyes had gone bright. "That's it, isn't it? That's what that man just tried to tear off you, the ones who aren't here." She put her own hand flat on the cold iron of the rail, not reaching across it, not touching him, only laying it there as near as the rule allowed. "You keep them on, love," she said. "You keep them right on." And she turned and went back into the crowd, and I do not know her name, and I never will. But of all the 200 people on the forecourt that afternoon, she was the only one who understood the whole of it before anyone told her, because she had lived beside a man who wore his grief where people could photograph it and never asked. And she knew a thing the clever lawyer would never in his life know, that the shine on a man's chest is the least of it, and the weight of it is all. Corin gave no sign. But when the changing of the guard came, 40 minutes on, and he turned to march off under the arch, his eyes passed once, only once, for less than a second, over the place at the rail where she had stood, and I saw it, and I have wondered ever since whether she is why he held his composure the whole long way in. A man can stand a great deal for a stranger who asks the right question. Sometimes that is the only thing that gets him through the arch. "You could have broken his arm," I said to him when the surgeon had gone. "On the rail, clean. Nobody would have said a word against you." "I know," Corin said. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, buttoning his shirt over the dressing. "Because there were frightened people behind that rail," he said at last. "A woman who'd step back, somebody's little one on a father's shoulders. If I break his arm across the iron in front of them, they don't remember a bad man stopped. They remember a red soldier snapping bones on the palace forecourt, and every one of those 40 cameras has it forever, and it's the guard they're afraid of after that, not him." He shrugged and winced and finished the last butt. "The medals were never in danger, Alwyn. They're pinned to hold. I knew they'd hold. So the only question was how to put him down and hurt no one and give the cameras a thing worth remembering for the right reason. That took a second and a half to work out. It felt longer." "It looked," I said, "like you were letting him rip them off." "I was," Corin said. "For a second and a half I was. I needed him committed. A man mid-pull can't defend himself. A man thinking about pulling can. I let him think he was winning so that when he wasn't, he'd have nowhere to go but down." He looked at me, and there was the ghost of something tired and old behind his eyes. "It's the same thing the river taught me. You don't fight the current head-on. You let it take you where it wants to go, and you use where it's already going to get where you need to be. Fighting it straight is how people drown." I have thought about that answer many times since. It is the closest Corin ever came, in my hearing, to explaining the whole of himself. We assumed that evening that the matter was more or less closed. A drunk thug had assaulted a guardsman, been taken by the patrol and handed to the civil authorities, and would in due course answer for it in the ordinary way. Corin's tunic would be mended, his chest would heal, and the 40 cameras would carry the clip around for a day or two and then move on to the next thing, as cameras do. We were wrong about all of it. By the next morning the clip had not moved on, it had multiplied. It is a strange thing, to watch a private moment of your friends become the property of the whole watching country overnight. By dawn the footage was everywhere, in a dozen versions shot from a dozen angles, and it had a life now entirely separate from the 11 seconds it had actually lasted. There was the wide shot from the coach party's side that caught the whole arc, the taunting, the reach, the pull, the fold, the man on his back. There was a closer one, shakier, that had somehow caught the exact instant Corin's gloved hand closed over the wrist, and that one had been slowed down and replayed until you could see, frame by frame, the precise economy of it, the way he trapped rather than struck. And there was a third, the one that did the most, shot from almost directly in front, that had caught his face at the moment he bent his head and said the words, "These do not come off, sir." And though there was no sound on it, someone had read his lips, and the words were now printed under the picture everywhere you looked, and the picture of the man's calm, unbroken face saying them had become, in the space of a night, a kind of emblem. But the footage was only half of it. The other half was the man on the ground, and here is where the story turned from an afternoon's incident into something with teeth, because it turned out that the crowd's ripple of recognition, when his hood fell back, had been right. Someone in that crowd had known his face. By mid-morning, the whole country knew it. The thug was not a random drunk. He was the younger son of a wealthy and well-connected family, a man with a name that opened doors and a history, carefully kept out of the papers until now, of exactly this kind of thing. Of taking because he was used to taking, of putting his hands where he pleased because no one had ever made him answer for it. He had a lawyer before lunch. He had by that same afternoon a story. And the story was that Corin had assaulted him. I remember the moment I understood they were going to try it, because it was so brazen that at first I did not believe it. It came in the form of a statement, released by the family's lawyer, and it was a small masterpiece of the art of turning a thing exactly upside down. It did not deny that their client had been at the rail. It admitted generously that he had engaged in some ill-advised horseplay, as young men will. But it asserted, with a straight face in formal language, to a country that had watched the footage, that the guardsman had grossly overreacted, had used disproportionate and unnecessary force against an unarmed member of the public, had caused injury, and that the family were considering all legal options, and expected a full account from the household authorities of why one of their soldiers had been permitted to brutalize a young man for a moment of high spirits. Brutalize? The word they chose was brutalize. I read it 3 times to be sure I had not misread it. A grown man had crossed a barrier and torn at another man's decorations hard enough to drive metal into his chest. And the crime, in their telling, was that the other man had declined to let him. I was angry. I will not pretend I was not. I was angry the way you are angry when someone lies about a thing you saw with your own eyes, which is a particular and helpless kind of anger, because a lie you witnessed feels as though it ought to be impossible, as though the world will surely correct it on its own. But Corin was not angry. That was the thing that steadied me, in the days that followed, more than anything else. I went to him that evening full of it, ready to rail against the statement, against the word brutalize, against the whole obscene reversal of it, and he heard me out, and when I had run down he said only, "Let them make their case, Alwyn. I made mine on the forecourt in front of 40 cameras. A lie has to work, the truth only has to be looked at." But it was not so simple, and Corin knew it was not, and I think he was calmer than he had any right to be because he had already understood before I had the true shape of the danger. The danger was never really the family's story. No one who had watched the footage believed it. The danger was that the household authorities, our own command, the men over us, might find it easier, in the face of a wealthy family and a lawyer and a threatened public row, to make the whole embarrassing matter go quietly away by sacrificing the one man who had done nothing wrong. That is how the powerful usually win. Not by being believed, but by making it expensive for anyone to stand against them, so that the expedient thing and the just thing part company, and the men in charge choose the expedient one and call it prudence. And for a few days, that is exactly the way it seemed to be going. An internal inquiry was convened, which was proper. An inquiry always is, when a guardsman lays hands on a member of the public, and Corin would have been the first to say so. But the inquiry did not feel, from the inside, like a search for the truth. It felt like a search for a way out. Corin was taken off public duty pending its findings. For his own protection, they said, and perhaps it was even meant kindly, but a guardsman taken off his post feels the removal like a wound, and Corin felt it. He was assigned to the interior rounds, the quiet corridors, out of the public eye, out of the light, and every day the box on the north forecourt was filled by another man, and Corin walked past the arch to his corridor and did not look at it. He never complained, but I saw what it cost him, because I had seen once before what it looked like when Corin Devane had a thing he loved taken out of his reach and had to keep standing anyway. The questions they put to him were not friendly questions. I know because I was called to as a witness, and because Corin told me some of it after. They asked him whether he had, in fact, needed to use any force at all. They asked whether a man of his training could not have simply stepped back and de-escalated. They asked, this one Corin repeated to me flat with no expression, which was how I knew it had cut him, whether his personal attachment to the decorations in question might have impaired his judgment and caused him to respond to a trivial provocation with disproportionate force. There it was again. The medals, which were the whole reason the thing had meaning, were being turned into evidence against him. His love for his dead brother was being reframed as a weakness, a bias, a reason to doubt him. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "The truth," Corin said, "that I could not step back because behind me was the crown's ground, and to my left were frightened people, and in front of me was a man committing an offense with his hand already on me. That stepping back would have taught him, and every man like him watching, that the ground gives if you push it. That I used the least force that would end it and hurt no one, and that if my judgment was impaired by anything it was impaired toward mercy, because a less disciplined man would have broken his arm and been within his rights." He paused. And then they asked me again whether the medals had impaired my judgment, in a slightly different way, as though asking twice would get a different answer. What the inquiry did to the rest of us in those days is a thing worth setting down, because a lie aimed at one man never stays aimed at only one man. Word went round the barracks, quietly, the way things go round a place where men are trained not to talk, that the household might sacrifice Corin to make the family go away, and I watched it change the younger guardsmen, not into cowards, into hesitators. I stood a post the third morning beside a lad of 19, new that season, and when a tourist leaned across the rail to flick at the buttons on his tunic for a laugh, I saw the boy's whole body lock in a way that was not discipline. It was fear. Fear of being the next man in an inquiry, the next man in a lawyer's statement, the next man called unstable for defending his own coat. He did nothing. He was right to do nothing. It was only a flick, not a theft. But I saw why he did nothing, and it was the wrong reason, and it turned my stomach. That was exactly the thing Corin had warned the gray man about, arriving already, before he had even signed anything. The mere threat of the paper was teaching young men to hesitate. And a hesitating guard is a guard who has been half taken off his post before anyone laid a hand on him. I told Corin about the boy. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, "That's the whole of why I won't sign in one lad. Multiply him by every man who ever stands that box after me." And I understood then that Corin was not being stubborn and was not being proud, whatever the gray man thought. He was standing his post. It was only that the post had moved from a box on the forecourt to a piece of paper in an office, and he was guarding it there the same way he guarded it in the Scarlet, by refusing to give the ground. The inquiry dragged. The family's lawyer, meanwhile, did not drag at all. He was everywhere giving statements, seeding doubt, and he was clever because he had found the one line of attack that could work against a man like Corin. He could not attack the footage. The footage was fatal to him. So he attacked the meaning of it. He conceded the pull. He conceded even that it had been boorish. And then he pivoted entirely onto Corin's response and Corin's medals and Corin's supposed instability, painting a picture of a decorated but haunted man, a man carrying a private grief, a man. He did not quite say the word, but he built the whole shape of it, unfit, unstable, dangerous to have standing armed on a public forecourt with a chip on his shoulder the size of a dead brother. It was cruel and it was clever, and for a few days, watching the tide of it, I was afraid it was going to work. Here is the moment I thought we had lost. It came about a week in. A senior figure from the household administration, not one of the guard, one of the palace's civil officers, a smooth gray man whose job was the avoidance of embarrassment, came down to the guardroom and had Corin brought to him and offered him, in the kindest possible voice, a way out. The way out was this. Corin would accept a formal note on his record acknowledging that his response had been greater than the situation required. In exchange, the inquiry would close with no further action. He would be quietly returned to duty in a month or two, the family would drop their threatened suit, and the whole unfortunate business would be over. Everyone would move on. No one would be hurt. It was, the gray man said, the sensible resolution, the mature resolution. The resolution that a man who cared about the regiment, rather than his own pride, would choose. And I want to be honest about this, because it is the false dawn of the whole story and it deserves to be told honestly. It was a genuinely tempting offer. It was not a trap with obvious jaws. It was worse than that. It was a soft, reasonable, exhausting door held open, and all Corin had to do to walk through it was agree that he had done slightly too much. Not that he had assaulted anyone, only that he had been a little heavy-handed, and in exchange he got his post back, his peace back, the cameras gone, the lawyer silenced, the family off his neck. He could stand his box again. He could stop walking past the arch. All it would cost was one small lie about that second and a half on the rail, and the small lie would even be a kindness, in a way, because it would let everyone save face and go home. He could have taken it. Most men would have taken it. It was the drownable current, the one you fight head-on at your peril, and this time the current was flowing toward an exit, and every reasonable instinct said to let it carry you. Corin looked at the gray man for a long moment, and then he said no. He said it without heat. In the same level voice he said everything, and he gave his reason. And his reason is the thing I have carried with me longest out of this whole affair. He said, "If I sign that, sir, then the next time a man reaches across that rail and takes hold of the medals on a guardsman's chest, the guardsman standing there will have been taught by my record that he is not permitted to stop him too firmly. He'll hesitate, and the man pulling won't. I'd be trading my month of peace for that guardsman's hesitation, and I won't do it." The response was correct. I'll say it was correct to the inquiry, to the family, to the Crown, or to anyone else who asks, and I'll keep saying it because it was. I did not do too much. I did exactly enough. And I will not sign a paper that says a soldier of the Guard did too much by refusing to let his honor be torn off his chest, because that paper would outlive me, and it would be a lie standing at that post long after I'm gone. The gray man went away unhappy, and I thought, watching him go, that Corin had just thrown away his own rescue for a principle, and that principle was going to cost him everything, and that the powerful were going to win the way the powerful usually win. I was wrong about that too, but I did not know yet what I did not know, and neither did the family, and neither did their clever lawyer. None of us knew what was already moving, quietly in the country beyond the palace walls, in a place none of the powerful ever think to look, among the ordinary people who had watched the footage, and who had understood in their unclever way exactly what they had seen. It began with a woman in the river country. She was a school teacher, retired now, and she had watched the footage on the small screen in her kitchen the way everyone had watched it, and she had heard the lawyer's story about the haunted, unstable guard with the chip on his shoulder, and something in the picture had snagged at her. The face. The name printed beneath it, Sergeant Corin Devane. She sat with it through an evening, and then she went and found in the back of a drawer a photograph she had kept for 11 years. A young man in a borrowed dry coat, thin with exhaustion, standing in the mud outside a flooded parish hall with two small girls asleep, one under each arm because they would not be put down and he had not made them. The young man in the photograph was thinner and younger, but it was the same face. It was the man who had carried her granddaughters out of the flood. For the schoolteacher was the mother of the schoolmistress next door, and the two small daughters of the schoolmistress. The ones the citation mentioned in its flat voice, brought out one under each arm through a current that had carried motorcars away, were her grandchildren. They were grown now, both of them. One nearly finished at the university, and they were alive, and they had a life ahead of them, because a 19-year-old boy named Tam Devane had woken the parish and drowned doing it, and his older brother had gone into the water 11 times and brought them out. The schoolteacher did a very simple thing. She wrote it down, what she had seen that night, who the man in the footage was, what he had done, what it had cost him, and she attached the photograph and she put it where people could read it. And then the daughters, the two grown girls, added their own words. And then the old man from the chimney across the lane, who was older still now but very much alive, added his. And then the neighbors. And then, one by one, the 11. Not all of them could speak. 11 years scatters people, and some had moved away, and one had since died of age in his own bed, which is the whole point of the thing. He got to die of age in his own bed. But the ones who could speak, spoke, and what they said could not have been more different from the lawyer's careful poison. They did not talk about an unstable man with a chip on his shoulder. They talked about the calmest person any of them had ever seen. They talked about a young guardsman who, on the worst night of all their lives, with his own brother lost in the black water, had not panicked, had not frozen, had not once let them see his own grief while he was carrying them, had gone back and back and back, counting them off, keeping them together, telling the frightened ones it was going to be all right in a voice so steady that they believed him even though the world was ending. He was 19 rescues of steady, the old man from the chimney said, in the words that got repeated most. I have never in my long life met a steadier man, and if you're telling me they're calling him unstable now, then somebody is lying to you and it isn't him. The country read it. And the country, which had been half persuaded by a clever lawyer that the calm man on the forecourt might be a dangerous man underneath, now learned exactly what that calm was made of, and where it had been forged, and what it had already saved. The tide did not merely turn. It reversed and became a flood of its own. The story of the medals, the real story, the third ribbon from the left, the king's promise, the brother in the willow 4 miles down, was everywhere by the end of that week, set beside the footage of the pull, and now when people watched the thug reach up and grip and haul, they were not watching a scuffle anymore. They were watching a man try to tear a drowned brother off the chest of the one who could not save him, and there is no lawyer clever enough to spin that. There is no statement smooth enough to survive it. The family's lawyer stopped giving statements. The threatened suit was quietly not filed. But by then it did not matter what the family did, because the matter had passed out of their hands and into a court far higher than any they could hire against. The king had been told. I do not know exactly when, or by whom, though I have my suspicions. Old Bracken, I think, who had 20 years in and a way of getting the truth to the top of a thing when the middle of it had gone crooked. But I know that the king had the whole of it put before him. The footage and the family's story and the inquiry's drift and the offer of the note and Corin's refusal to sign it, and above all, the words of the 11 from the river country. And I know what the king did, because it was done in the open, deliberately in the open, in front of the same cameras that had carried the lie, so that the answer would reach exactly as far as the accusation had. He came down to the forecourt himself. It was not a scheduled thing. There was no ceremony announced. But word travels, and by the time the king's party came out under the North Arch on a bright cold morning 8 days after the pull, there was a crowd behind the rail 3 deep, and the phones were up, and the box on the forecourt was filled, for the king had ordered it, by Sergeant Corin Devane, returned to his post that very morning, in a tunic mended so well you could not find the tear, his medals hanging straight and true over the place where the bruise of them was still fading from his skin. The king walked the line of guardsmen as though on an ordinary inspection, unhurried, and I stood in that line, and I have never been so glad of the discipline that kept my own face still, because my heart was going like a drum. He stopped in front of Corin. He looked at the medals, the 4 of them and the 3rd from the left, and then he looked at the man wearing them, and then he turned deliberately so that his face and Corin's were both toward the cameras, and he spoke, and he did not lower his voice, because he meant every soul on that forecourt and every soul watching on a screen to hear it. 8 days ago, the king said, a man reached across this rail and tried to tear these decorations from your chest, and I am told that certain persons have since suggested that you did wrong to prevent him. I am told there was even a paper prepared for you to sign, agreeing that you had done too much. He let that sit for a moment in the cold air. I have read the account of what you did on the night these were earned. I pinned the third of them there myself in the mud 11 years ago, and I told you then that it was the country's word that it saw what you did and would not forget it. I find that some in my own household had begun to forget it rather quickly. That is corrected as of this morning." He turned then to the crowd, to the cameras, and he said the thing that ended it. "Let it be understood by anyone who thinks a name or a family or a lawyer places him above the law of this ground. The decorations a soldier of this guard wears on his chest are not his private property to be pulled at for a laugh. They are the crown's, and they are the country's, and they mark what a man gave so that others might live. To lay hands on them is not horseplay. It is an assault upon the honor of the realm, and it will be answered as one. Sergeant Devane did not do too much. He did precisely his duty, with a restraint that shames the man who tested it, and I will say so to any court that cares to ask." A pause. "The inquiry is closed. The finding is that the sergeant acted correctly and with commendable restraint, and the note that certain persons wished him to sign has been destroyed, unsigned, in my presence." Then the king did a small thing that undid me, and undid half the crowd, and I have never forgotten it. He raised his hand, the same hand that had pinned the third medal in the mud 11 years before, and he laid it, just for a moment, flat over the row of decorations on Corin's chest, over the exact place where a thug had tried to tear them off and a bruise in their shape was still fading underneath. He did not pull. He pressed, gently, as if to fix them there, as if to say, "These stay." And then he stepped back and inclined his head to the sergeant, the king to the guardsman, and moved on down the line, and Corin Devane stood his box with his eyes forward and his medals straight and did not move a muscle, though I saw, when the king had passed, a single line of wet run down from beneath the shadow of his bearskin, and he let it fall, because to raise a gloved hand to it would have been to move, and he would not move. He had stood through worse without moving. He let the country see that a statue can weep and still not break. It may be the bravest thing I ever watched him do. The consequences for the thug came in their own time, in the ordinary machinery of the law, and they were not dramatic, and that is exactly why they were just. He had assumed all along that his name would carry him out of it, that it always had before, that it always would. It did not. There was no clever way around 40 cameras and a king's public word and the reverse tide of a whole country, and his lawyer, who was clever, knew it, and advised him accordingly. He answered for what he had done at the rail, for the assault upon a soldier at his post, and for the attempted theft of decorations awarded by the crown, which the law takes a graver view of than the man had ever imagined. He did not go free with a laugh. He was bound over, fined heavily, made to answer in the open the way he had made Corin answer in the open, his face in every account, not the swaggering face from the forecourt, but the smaller, grayer face of a man discovering that the ground does not, in fact, give if you push it hard enough. And the two friends who had filmed him and bet 10 quid he could make the doll break were named too, in the end, as witnesses who had encouraged the offense, and they did not enjoy the naming. The friends of the arrogant man are his friends only up to the moment it costs something. After that, they are simply people who were standing near him, and now they were people who were standing near him in the record forever. I have wondered since whether the thug ever understood what he actually did that afternoon, whether it ever reached him in the gray small hours what his fist had closed around. I doubt it. Men like that do not, as a rule, learn. But I like to think that once, just once, alone somewhere, he saw the footage again with the story attached to it now, and understood at last that when he reached across that rail, he had put his hand on a drowned boy's name, and on 11 living people, and on the one place in the world where a grieving man could still stand beside his brother, and had tried to tear all of it off for a laugh and 10 quid, and that the whole strength of a man's held grief had met his hand and refused to give, and put him on his back on the cold stones in front of the very crowd he'd gathered to admire him, If he understood even that much, it would be more than I expect of him. But I hope he did, not for his sake, for Tam's, so that somewhere in the world one more person knows the name. Corin stood the North Box for another 3 years after that, and then took a training post, teaching the young ones the thing he had spent his life learning, which was not how to fight. Any fool can be taught to fight, but how to be still, how to hold, how to do exactly enough and not one grain more, and how to know the difference in the half a second you are given to know it. I was one of the men who watched him teach it, and I heard him tell the young guardsman more than once the thing he had told me in the guardroom with his tunic open and the metal-shaped bruise blooming over his heart. You do not fight the current head-on. You let it take you where it's already going, and you use that to get where you need to be. Fighting it straight is how people drown. They photograph the medals still, the tourists on the forecourt, zooming in on the bright buttons against the red, and most of them will never know. That is all right. Corin never needed them to know. He needed only to feel the ribbons hold when the pull came. And they held because they were pinned to hold. Because a king had fixed them there with his own hand and pressed them back into place with it 11 years later. And because the man wearing them had decided, long before any thug ever reached across a rail, that they would come off his chest only when he was carried off his post, and not 1 second before. I stood beside Corin Devane for the better part of 9 years, 12 feet to his left at the far pillar, close enough to hear a whisper and forbidden to answer one, and I broke that rule exactly once, on a gray afternoon, to say his name into the space between us, because I could not bear to say nothing while a man reached in to take his brother off his chest. He never once told me not to. And I have thought in all the years since that of all the things I learned standing at that post, the drill, the stillness, the arithmetic of the half-second, the truest thing I learned was the simplest, and it is this, that the shine of a thing tells you nothing, and that the whole of a man's worth is in what it cost him to earn it, and that there is no fortune, no name, no clever lawyer, and no fist strong enough to tear that away from a man who has decided, all the way down, that it stays. These do not come off, sir, not for you. Not ever,